For 20 years, nobody questioned it. It was clean, it was efficient, it was marketed as safe. And it worked. In the 1990s, chemical weed control was framed as the breakthrough American agriculture had been waiting for. Spray once. Clean field, less tillage, lower labor, higher efficiency. That was the pitch. And to be fair, in the beginning, it delivered. Farmers were told this wasn't like the old harsh chemistries. This was different, targeted, environmentally responsible, a smarter molecule for a smarter era. It aligned perfectly with a new wave of farming philosophy. Fewer passes, less soil disturbance, streamlined systems, less complexity. It felt like progress. And progress is seductive, because progress promises control. For a generation of producers who had battled mechanical cultivation limits, erosion issues, unpredictable weather, and rising labor costs, this looked like leverage. A way to simplify the operation without sacrificing yield. And for a while, the numbers supported it. Cleaner rows, strong emergence, reduced early competition, equipment parked more often, time saved, margins improved. But here's what almost nobody asked in 1995. What happens if we rely on one tool too heavily? Not misuse, not abuse, just dependence. Because nature doesn't negotiate. Every time you remove 99% of a weed population, the 1% that survives isn't random. It survives for a reason. Genetics. Resilience is not new, it's evolutionary math. When a field is sprayed once, twice, season after season, year after year, the weeds that survive pass that tolerance forward. At first, it's subtle. A patch here, a corner there. Most operators didn't panic. They increased rate slightly, or adjusted timing, or added a tank mix. It still worked, until it didn't. The problem wasn't visible in year 3. It wasn't obvious in year 5. But somewhere around year 10, fields that used to clean up in one pass needed 2. Then 3. Then higher concentration. Then a secondary product. Costs crept up quietly. Nobody framed it as resistance yet. It was called tough weeds. It was called weather timing. It was called application issue. Because admitting systemic resistance would mean admitting something uncomfortable. The miracle solution wasn't permanent. And agriculture doesn't like temporary tools presented as permanent ones. Here's where the economic trap begins. When a product is labeled safe, reliable, and foundational, it becomes integrated into everything else. Equipment selection, crop planning, seed genetics, field rotation strategies. Remove that pillar and the structure shakes. By the early 2000s, some university extension reports were already documenting shifts in weed populations. Certain species were no longer controlled at previous rates. But the messaging never changed. Marketing stayed optimistic. Field reality grew complicated, and most farmers did what farmers do. They adapted, they layered, they increased rates, they mixed chemistries, short-term solutions. Because in agriculture, you don't have the luxury of pausing the system to rethink philosophy. You have a planting window. And that's the critical pressure point. The promise of simplicity had created operational dependency. And dependency is profitable, not necessarily for the producer, but for the supply chain. Let's step back. If a weed population develops resistance slowly, over 2 decades, who absorbs that cost? The farmer, not the lab, not the regulatory agency, not the marketing department. The farmer pays in higher rates, additional passes, new chemistries, equipment wear, fuel, time, and yield drag. And here's the deeper issue. Resistance doesn't just increase chemical cost. It increases system complexity. More products in the tank mean more calibration sensitivity, more nozzle wear, more potential drift, more risk of application error, more strain on pumps and seals. The hidden cost isn't just chemical, it's mechanical. A boom sprayer running more acres, more frequently, under tighter timing windows accumulates wear faster. And nobody marketed that part in 1996. The 90s pitch was clean. The 2020s reality is layered. Now we have fields where certain weed species survive doses that once wiped them out entirely. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't unpredictable. Resistance is not shocking. It is expected when selection pressure is constant. The real question is not, how did this happen? The real question is, why did we act surprised? Because the warning signs were visible long before they became widespread. Scattered patches, localized failures, isolated cases. But isolated cases are easy to dismiss when overall yield remains stable. Agriculture often tolerates creeping inefficiency until it becomes undeniable. And by the time it becomes undeniable, it's expensive. So part 1 of this story isn't about villainizing chemistry. It's about examining the word, safe. Safe for what? Safe for soil? Safe for equipment? Safe for 5 years? Safe for 25? Because safety framed in the short term can become instability in the long term. And that's where we're headed next. In part 2, we break down what resistance actually costs per acre, not just in product, but in yield compression, fuel burn, labor hours, and equipment degradation. Because the myth isn't emotional, it's financial, and numbers don't lie, they compound. Resistance doesn't arrive like a storm, it shows up like a rounding error. One extra pass, a slightly higher rate, a second product added, just in case. At first, it feels manageable. You tell yourself it's temporary, a seasonal anomaly, a weather issue. But agriculture doesn't bleed all at once. It bleeds quietly. Let's break this down the way most marketing never does. The first layer, chemical cost creep. In the early adoption years, a single pass program might have handled broadleaf and grass pressure effectively. Clean field, done. Then a species survives, so you increase rate by 10 to 20%. Then you add a residual. Then maybe a second mode of action. Individually, each adjustment looks small. Per acre, maybe it's an extra $3. Then $7. Then $12. Now multiply that by 1,500 acres. That minor adjustment is suddenly a new equipment payment. But here's the dangerous part. It didn't feel dramatic. It scaled slowly, and because commodity prices fluctuate, input inflation gets hidden inside broader volatility. You can't see resistance clearly when corn is up 40 cents or diesel jumps $1. But the margin erosion is real, and it stacks. The second layer, pass frequency. When one pass doesn't finish the job, timing windows tighten. Instead of a relaxed spray schedule, you're chasing growth stages. Late weeds demand action. More acres get covered under pressure, which leads to longer days, higher stress, more mistakes. And here's something rarely discussed. Sprayers don't get stronger with age. Every extra acre adds wear to pumps, seals, hoses, nozzles, flow meters, pressure regulators. Calibration becomes more sensitive as systems age. When chemistries become layered and complex, precision matters more. One clogged tip can create uneven control. Uneven control accelerates resistance pockets. And resistance pockets force heavier application next season. See the loop? It's not just chemical resistance. It's operational escalation. The third layer, fuel and labor. 2 extra passes across 1,500 acres is not theoretical. It's diesel, it's labor hours, it's maintenance cycles shortened by real-world friction. Even if automation reduces labor strain, fuel and machine depreciation remain. And depreciation is merciless. A machine rated for X acres per season now covers 1.3x. The resale value math shifts. The capital cycle shortens. Nobody marketed that outcome in the 90s. The fourth layer, yield drag. This one is subtle. When resistant weeds survive early competition, they steal sunlight and nutrients during critical growth windows. Even if you control them later, the damage is done. You don't always see it dramatically. It might be a 2% yield hit, maybe 3%. On a 200 bushel crop, that's 4 to 6 bushels per acre. Multiply that by acreage, multiply that by price. Now ask yourself, how many extra chemical dollars were spent to defend against a yield loss that still happened? Resistance doesn't always wipe out a field. It taxes it, quietly, relentlessly. The fifth layer, system rigidity. Here's where it becomes strategic. When a chemical program becomes foundational to your no-till or reduced-till system, resistance limits flexibility. You don't just lose weed control efficiency. You lose options. Maybe mechanical intervention becomes necessary again in certain acres. Maybe crop rotation needs to expand. Maybe you're forced to adopt new seed traits or technologies to compensate. All of that costs money. All of that was not part of the safe simplicity pitch. The original promise was fewer variables. The long-term outcome was more variables. And more variables increase management load. For producers in their 60s and 70s, management load matters. You built your system for efficiency. Resistance reintroduces friction. The compound effect. Here's what nobody modeled clearly 2 decades ago. Selection pressure plus repeated use plus large acreage equals inevitability. Not possibility. Inevitability. The question was never if. It was when. And once resistance establishes, reversing it is not simple. Because now you're fighting a weed population that has adapted genetically to survive your primary tool. That is not a marketing problem. That is biology. And biology doesn't care about quarterly earnings. The psychological cost. There's another layer farmers rarely admit. Frustration. When something that worked flawlessly for years begins to fail, trust erodes. You question your timing, your calibration, your judgment, but sometimes the issue isn't operator error. It's systemic over-reliance, and that's hard to swallow because it implies long-term strategy adjustment, not short-term tweak. Agriculture rewards decisiveness. Resistance demands humility. That tension is uncomfortable. So what's the real number? If you combine increased chemical spend, additional passes, accelerated equipment wear, fuel inflation, yield drag, added management complexity, resistance is not a $5 per acre problem. In some operations, it becomes a $25 to $40 per acre drag over time. On large acreage, that's 6 figures annually. Not in one dramatic invoice, but in accumulated friction. And friction is expensive. The bigger question, was the chemistry effective? Yes. Was it safer than older alternatives? In many ways, yes. Did it simplify systems in the short term? Absolutely. But did anyone model 25 years of uniform dependence across millions of acres? That's the conversation we avoided. Because in the short term, everything looked like progress. In the long term, monoculture thinking, whether in crops or chemistry, creates vulnerability. Part 3 is where this gets uncomfortable. Because resistance didn't just happen biologically. It happened structurally, and once a system is structured around a single solution, unwinding it becomes disruptive. Next, we examine how the industry messaging evolved, and what it didn't say out loud. Resistance didn't just grow in the field, it grew inside the system. By the early 2000s, resistance cases were no longer isolated. University data started showing consistent survival patterns in certain weed species. Regional pockets became multi-state problems. But notice something interesting. The messaging didn't shift to reduce reliance. It shifted to add another product. That's a structural response, not a biological one. When the first cracks appeared, the solution offered wasn't diversification of strategy. It was stacking, stacked traits, stacked chemistries, stacked modes of action. On paper, that sounds responsible. Rotate modes, use multiple actives, reduce selection pressure. And technically, that advice isn't wrong. But here's the issue. The core framework stayed chemical first. The foundation never changed. Instead of rethinking dependence, the industry optimized dependence. If one molecule lost strength, introduce a companion. If two lost strength, introduce a triple program. If weeds adapt, escalate. That's not evil, that's business logic. But business logic and biological sustainability are not always aligned. Let's zoom out. In the 90s, the promise was simplicity. One primary tool, clean field. By the 2010s, recommendations looked like layered defense systems. Pre-emergence residual, early post-emergence, late post-cleanup, burn-down adjustments. The number of SKUs increased. The complexity increased. Dealer relationships deepened. Input financing structures adapted. At what point does a system stop being simple efficiency and start being managed dependency? Because here's something most farmers intuitively understand. When a product is foundational to your crop plan, your seed traits, your equipment setup, and your labor schedule, changing it is disruptive. And disruption carries risk, so even if resistance is visible, the incentive is to adjust within the framework, not challenge it. That's structural inertia. It's easier to add a jug than redesign a strategy. Now let's talk incentives. A chemical company's revenue depends on volume. A dealer's revenue depends on product movement. A seed platform tied to chemical compatibility benefits from integrated adoption. None of that is conspiracy. It's alignment of incentives, but alignment for them is not always alignment for you. Because your incentive is long-term soil productivity and cost control, their incentive is quarterly performance and market share. Again, not villainy, just different scoreboards. And when resistance began expanding across millions of acres, the solution offered was innovation through addition. New formulations, new combinations, new trait platforms, each one promising improved control, each one adding cost. What was rarely emphasized loudly? Reduction of overall chemical dependency through structural change. Because structural change means fewer gallons. And fewer gallons is not a growth strategy. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Farmers were not forced into this. They chose it, because it worked, because it was efficient, because it simplified labor management, because it reduced tillage passes, because time is limited and margins are tight. The system didn't trap unwilling participants. It rewarded compliance with short-term gains. And that's how long-term traps form. Slowly, through success. Here's the deeper layer most people don't want to confront. When resistance data first emerged, it was framed as localized adaptation. Localized means manageable. Localized means temporary. Localized does not trigger systemic rethink. But resistance biology does not respect county lines. If a resistant population establishes and spreads through seed movement, equipment transfer, wind dispersal, and harvesting patterns, the expansion is predictable. The industry knew resistance was possible. Resistance had happened before with other chemistries decades earlier. This wasn't unprecedented science. What was unprecedented was scale. Millions of acres using similar programs across similar crop systems. That scale accelerates selection pressure. And yet the dominant narrative remained, we have the next solution. Not, we may need to rebalance the entire framework. Now think about the psychological positioning. When a farmer experiences reduced control, he doesn't immediately blame the system. He assumes application issue, timing issue, weather interference, because admitting systemic design flaw implies vulnerability. And agriculture culture values control. So the narrative stayed tactical, never strategic, more rate, better timing, add residual, upgrade trait. It took years before the phrase, multiple resistant populations, entered common conversation. By then, chemical programs had become layered and expensive. And here's the most important structural reality. When your input costs rise gradually across decades, you normalize them. You don't compare 1998 simplicity to 2025 complexity every season. You compare last year to this year. That's incremental blindness. And incremental blindness protects systems from scrutiny. The myth wasn't that the chemistry was safe short-term. The myth was that it would remain singularly effective long-term. The myth was permanence. And permanence sells better than manage carefully or face consequences. Now we're at a turning point. Because today, resistant species in some regions survive multiple modes of action. That's not a marketing hiccup. That's biological escalation. When a weed tolerates 2 or 3 control pathways, the cost of management rises sharply. And this is where structure collides with reality. You cannot out-innovate evolution indefinitely. You can delay it, you can manage it, but if the foundation remains over-reliance, the clock keeps ticking. Part 4 is where we go practical. Because criticizing structure without offering direction is just noise. Next, we examine what diversified resistance management actually looks like financially and operationally, and why it requires a mindset shift, not just a new product. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot solve a resistance problem using the same dependency logic that created it. Adding another jug is not diversification. It's escalation, and escalation always raises cost. So what does actual resistance management look like when you strip away marketing language? It looks like friction. It looks like complexity. It looks like giving up a little short-term convenience to protect long-term control. And that's why most operations delay it. Let's break this into practical layers. 1. Chemical rotation that actually rotates. A lot of farms say they rotate, but in reality, they rotate brands, not modes of action. True rotation means fundamentally changing the selection pressure. That requires planning crop sequence, residual timing, and post-programs as a system. Not reacting mid-season. It also means sometimes using an older chemistry strategically to reduce reliance on the dominant one. Not because it's trendy, because biology doesn't care about trend cycles. The mistake of the 90s wasn't using chemistry. It was uniformity. Uniformity is efficient. Uniformity is also fragile. 2. Crop rotation as a weapon, not a tradition. When crop rotation becomes predictable and limited, weed species adapt to the rhythm. Diverse crop sequences change planting dates, canopy structure, fertility timing, and harvest windows. That shifts the advantage. Resistance thrives in predictability. Disrupt it. That might mean adding a crop that isn't the highest margin choice in the short term. That's the trade-off most people resist. Because spreadsheets reward this year's margin, not decade-long stability. But if resistant pressure continues increasing, short-term optimization becomes long-term erosion. 3. Mechanical intervention without going backward. This is where pride kicks in. Many producers adopted reduced-till systems for valid reasons: erosion control, moisture retention, fuel savings. Nobody is suggesting going back to 1980. But strategic mechanical disruption in targeted acres is not regression. It's diversification of pressure. The goal is not abandoning efficiency. It's avoiding monoculture control. A single shallow pass in problem zones may prevent 5 years of escalating chemistry. The math changes when you zoom out. 4. Early detection instead of late reaction. Most resistance becomes visible when it's already expensive. The earlier a resistant patch is isolated, the cheaper it is to manage. That means scouting seriously again. Not assuming program success. Not trusting uniform green from the cab. Boots on ground. Because by the time resistant populations spread across full sections, control becomes layered and costly. Small patches are affordable. Widespread resistance is a capital drain. 5. Rethinking, clean field, psychology. This one hits ego. For decades, perfectly clean rows became the visual symbol of good management. Anything less looked sloppy, but zero visible weed pressure at all times often requires maximum selection pressure. And maximum selection pressure accelerates adaptation. Perfection is expensive. Controlled tolerance in non-critical windows may reduce pressure. This isn't negligence, it's strategic balance, but it requires confidence. And agriculture culture is built on visible precision. Now let's talk money again. Diversification costs something up front. Extra planning time, different equipment adjustments, potentially slight yield trade-offs during transition years. That's real, but compare that to $30 per acre escalating programs, accelerated sprayer depreciation, resistant populations requiring extreme measures, yield drag from early competition. The question becomes, are you paying to prevent a problem or paying to chase one? Prevention feels optional, chasing is mandatory, and mandatory is always more expensive. Now here's the big mental shift. The 90s sold simplicity, the 2020s demand resilience. Simplicity optimizes efficiency, resilience optimizes survival. Those are not the same objective. Resilient systems intentionally avoid over-reliance. They distribute pressure. They create unpredictability for weeds. They avoid single-point failure. That's engineering logic. And farms are engineered systems whether we admit it or not. Here's the irony. Many of the most experienced farmers already know this instinctively. Older generations diversified because they had fewer chemical crutches. They rotated more aggressively. They cultivated when necessary. They didn't assume permanence. Somewhere along the way, convenience replaced caution. Not because farmers became careless. Because tools improved and time compressed. But biology never stopped playing the long game. And now the bill for long-term uniformity is arriving. The choice isn't panic. The choice isn't abandoning chemistry. The choice is rebalancing control tools before resistance forces your hand. Because once multiple resistance establishes across an entire operation, options narrow. And narrowing options increases dependency again. Which brings us to the final piece. Part 5 is where we address the hardest question. Was it a lie? Or was it a half-truth that became dangerous over time? And more importantly, what does smart agriculture look like for the next 20 years? Let's answer the question directly. Was it a lie? Not exactly. The chemistry worked. It reduced tillage. It simplified weed control. It improved efficiency. In many cases, it was safer than what came before. That part was real. The lie wasn't in the molecule. The lie was in the implication of permanence. The quiet assumption that one dominant solution could carry millions of acres indefinitely without biological consequences. That was never realistic. And here's the thing most people miss. Half-truths are more dangerous than outright lies. Because they succeed long enough to build dependence. If a product fails immediately, nobody builds a system around it. But if it works brilliantly for 10 to 15 years, it becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure is hard to question. By the time resistance became widespread, farms weren't just using a product. They were structured around it. Equipment setups, seed traits, crop sequencing, labor planning, dealer relationships, financing cycles. You don't pivot that overnight. So instead of structural change, we saw escalation. Higher rates, stacked modes, more complex programs, which worked, temporarily. But here's the cold truth. You cannot permanently outpace evolution with escalation. You can delay it, you can manage it, you cannot eliminate it, and agriculture works on decades, not quarters. So what does smart farming look like for the next 20 years? It doesn't look like abandoning chemistry. That's unrealistic. It doesn't look like romanticizing the past. That's emotional. It looks like strategic humility. Here's what that means. 1. No single pillar. If one tool becomes indispensable, it becomes dangerous. Every system needs redundancy. Aviation learned that decades ago. Engineering learned that centuries ago. Agriculture is relearning it now. If one chemistry disappears tomorrow, your farm should not collapse. If it would, that's not efficiency. That's fragility. 2. Biology is an opponent, not a variable. For years, weed control was treated like a technical setting. Dial rate, dial timing, execute, but resistance forces a mindset shift. You are not managing a static problem. You are competing with adaptive biology. And adaptive biology punishes predictability. The farms that thrive long-term will be the ones that introduce variability intentionally. Different timings, different crops, different pressures, not chaos. Strategic unpredictability. 3. Profit over pride. The cleanest field is not always the most profitable field long-term. That's uncomfortable, because pride runs deep in agriculture. But if chasing visual perfection accelerates resistance and increases cost over time, the pride tax becomes real. Profitability requires zooming out, not this season, not next season, 10 seasons, 20. 4. Question the word safe. Whenever a new product enters the market labeled safe, revolutionary, or permanent, the right response isn't rejection. It's caution. Safe short-term? Safe under what usage pattern? Safe under what acreage scale? Safe under what repetition? Nothing used at scale is consequence-free. Scale magnifies everything, and modern agriculture operates at historic scale, which means consequences scale too. 5. The real competitive edge. The next 20 years won't be won by who sprays the most efficiently. They'll be won by who manages risk the smartest. Risk of resistance, risk of cost creep, risk of system rigidity. The edge belongs to operators who think like system designers, not just input buyers. Because here's the brutal math. If resistance continues expanding at current trends, the cost of chemical programs won't stabilize. They'll escalate, and at some point, margins compress to the point where flexibility disappears. That's the real danger, not weeds, rigidity. So was it a scam? No. Was it incomplete truth packaged as permanence? Yes. And permanence is the most expensive illusion in agriculture. Here's the final reality. Farmers weren't fooled because they were naive. They adopted what worked. They optimized around efficiency. They trusted data available at the time. That's rational behavior. But rational behavior in one decade can create vulnerability in the next. The only mistake is refusing to adapt once evidence changes. And evidence has changed. Resistance is no longer rare. It's structural, which means the solution must be structural too. The future isn't chemical-free. It's dependency-aware. It's diversified. It's intentional. It respects biology instead of assuming control over it. Because the farm that survives the next 20 years won't be the one that finds the next miracle jug. It'll be the one that never builds its foundation on just one. That's not ideology. That's math. And math, unlike marketing, doesn't negotiate.